everyone. This is Solum Literary Press. I'm your host, Bart Cruz.
And I'm your co-host, Riley Bounds.
And this is the first episode of the Solum Podcast, where we discuss and examine the intersection of the modern renaissances in Christian literature, philosophy, and spiritual formation in evangelicalism. Today, we're excited to invite renowned Christian poet D.S. Martin to the podcast. D.S. Martin is the author of 4 poetry collections, 2 of which include Ampersand and Conspiracy of Light, poems inspired by the legacy of C.S. Lewis. He is poet in residence at McMaster Divinity College, the series editor for the Poemia poetry series, and has edited 3 anthologies, The Turning Aside, Adam, Eve, and The Riders of the Apocalypse, and In a Strange Land. And most recently, 3 of his poems were published in our inaugural Solum journal in the fall of 2020. He is a father to 2 adult sons and a husband, living with his wife in Brampton, Ontario. And you can find him at his website, dsmartin.ca. Also, more information will be provided in the show notes, as well as a link to his contributor page on the Solum website if you want to find out more about him. Don, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us on the Solum Podcast.
I'm honored.
Awesome. Well, let's get started. So we published 3 of your poems, and one of those is An Angel Questions Our Answers in, our fall 2020 edition. So what struck me was the last section of the first stanza. It says, "But please, descendant of dust, trust us when we say there's so much more you don't get." And what did you have in mind when writing that? I personally see this sort of as an angel helping or aiding the audience, man, presumably, as they plead for them to understand their limitations and their finiteness. And sort of, I didn't write this in the question, but on the other side of it, I was thinking in the background of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, where you have the demons sort of conspiring against man, but in your writing and in your work, you have the opposite end where, although it might seem demeaning to say to humans, you don't get it. I think that's actually a benefit. So I was just wondering if I'm reading your writing or your poem correctly, like what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Bart, you're absolutely right. What I'm doing here, I'm kind of interacting in this poem with the idea that, well, we're always trying to make the mysteries of God fit into our own interpretations, into our systematic theologies, into our statements of faith and such. And I believe scripture is written using poetry and story. Those are the primary literary vehicles that are used. They're used to help us see that God doesn't want us leaning on our own understanding. And yet it seems we're always fighting against him in this. And I think if you read that poem with what I just said in light, I don't even think you need what I just said, really, because you are quite right with your interpretation. I think it's probably one of my more transparent poems in a certain way, because it's wrestling against some of those things.
Yeah, that's great, Don. Thank you. So my next question would be, why should people care about poetry, especially non-poets? In America, especially, we live in such a culture where science is so revered and the arts are, they're viewed as kind of non-essential. And so what would be the kind of the practical end of that? Like, why should a plumber or, a doctor or somebody else who has to get up at 5 a.m, every day to care about poetry?
Well, really, Riley, what you're saying is, why should we care about art? And to me, the short answer is beauty and goodness and truth. I believe the primary purpose of the Bible is to teach us about God. And the main thing we learn about God in Genesis chapter 1 is that he's creative. We also hear the mysterious idea that we have been made in his image. So if we put all those ideas together, you'll see why I feel we should care about all forms of creativity. And I don't merely mean the arts, because I think everyone is creative in one way or another, and we don't always, sometimes we just look at what we call the arts in quotation marks, but everyone has creativity in them. Again, looking at the Bible, we see that the primary form of expression that God has included in Scripture is poetry. So my question would be, how are pastors, theologians, or ordinary churchgoers going to be able to read and understand the Bible if they do not know how to understand poetry? I believe many errors of interpretation would be completely eliminated if pastors regularly read poetry. Reading poetry is a spiritual discipline. It's an exercise in discernment. Poetry teaches us how to question what we are reading. It teaches us to unravel what a written text is saying and ask ourselves if we understand it and if we agree with it. Martin Luther believed that nothing better equips people for the skillful study of Scripture than literary study. Reading poetry teaches us to slow down. Our society has little patience for such things as poetry or authentic spirituality. We need to learn how to slow down if we want to engage with either poetry or authentic spirituality. Besides all this, poetry is a wonderful vehicle for playfully seeking how to understand our world. It's both serious and fun at the same time.
I loved your answer, Don. And what struck me about that whole answer, I know there's a lot in there, but I think the fact that you said reading poetry can be a spiritual discipline, I found that very true to be. I found that to be very true in my life, personally. Yeah, that's just. I wonder if you could say more about that. Yeah, it's just a curious thought.
Well, I really believe that we as a people, especially now, probably more so than ever before in my thinking, although I'm sure there were times in history this could also be said, but right now, perhaps more than any other time, we have people on different, let's just say political spectrums, never mind the spiritual, which is even more significant, but on political spectrums, we have people on the right, people on the left who do not stop and discern. They just listen to what they hear, they buy it totally and run with it. What poetry helps us to do is to stop and say, is this true? And I think it's important to read poetry, not just the poetry of the Bible, which you come to it and you say, okay, I'm going to just agree that everything's true and go through it, but to read poetry by Christian poets, by non-Christian poets, and say to yourself as you're reading, is that true? Or do I agree with that? Or if I don't agree with it, is there truth there that maybe I'm reading it the wrong way? I need to think about this more. It's a place to wrestle with truth and to get at truth and to learn discernment, a school for discernment.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're positing the task to just learn how to listen and have a conversation well. Because, a lot, like you alluded to, a lot of that is lost in our day and age. So yeah, wonderful. So I guess, how should you might have gone into this a little bit, but maybe if you have anything specific you want to add, how should someone read a poem? How should they approach it? Maybe more on a practical level of sorts.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm going to say one word I've said already, and that is slowly. You don't read a poem like you read a news article or an email or even most novels. You must read a poem slowly. It's a little like the way you follow a detailed recipe. You start at the beginning and only move forward once you have a sense of where it's going. or when you encounter something that you need to focus on. Now, even if you disagree with some aspect of this recipe, you're a great cook or great baker and you disagree with some aspect, you still need to pay close attention to it to understand what they're saying so that you know what you're doing. And if you don't know what an ingredient in the recipe is, you have to find out. So in some cases, you have to do a little bit of research. In most cases, the average intelligent adult reader should be able to discern what a well-written poem is about. Now, I'm sure you can easily find lots of poetry that contradicts what I just said, but I really believe that the best poetry is discernible, at least at some level, quite quickly by an intelligent reader. There may be extra things they need to dive in, they need to spend time with, but really I believe a poem should invite the reader in.
Yeah, that's excellent, Don. Thank you. So I was thinking about all that you said, and how people should approach poetry and process it. It kind of occurred to me that reading poetry can actually help in other areas of analysis. I can say that in my own life, like, I have a pretty good interest in poetry, but I'm also at the tail end of a graduate philosophy degree. And as somebody who had no prior experience at an undergraduate level with philosophy, being able to read poetry well really helped me to be able to sit down and get to the core of an argument or a thesis. And I think that that's another good reason to read poetry. So kind of piggybacking off that, do you have any ideas for getting kids or children interested in poetry? Because I think that, like with anything else, if you start young, it becomes a lot easier to do in the future. So yeah, how would you go about that?
Well, for kids, I'd say it's actually the opposite approach that you take than with adults, because poetry is the native language of children. They love the playful musical sounds of the words, even if they don't have a clue what they mean. I mean, who cares if Little Jack Horner is really a poem about some steward during the reign of Henry VIII who stole some real estate which had been intended as a bribe for the king? It's the fun sound of the rhyme that makes it appealing. Think about skipping rhymes, about Dr. Seuss, about tongue twisters, about nonsense songs. I suggest that people read all kinds of poetry with their kids. And in your day-to-day life, show them that it's okay to talk in fun and silly ways, to be playful with language, because that's what poetry is. Children love poetry until someone makes them feel stupid for not understanding everything in it. And there I'm going to point the big finger at our academic world, because they love poetry that makes them look intelligent and other people look foolish. And that actually leads to a lot of poetry, which I think isn't as good or needs to be adapted for people. So you have this playful music in the language, and that comes before the comprehension. As children grow older, you gradually introduce them to deeper poems. Consider ones such as Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, and let them enjoy the poem at whatever level they want to. Again, it doesn't have to be a school thing where they need to be able to analyze it or write an essay about it. Just let them enjoy it and encourage them to memorize short poems and passages from the Psalms, for example. I believe memorizing the Psalms and other musical, poetic pieces of scripture also instill a love for beautiful language. I grew up on the King James Version, which of course is incredibly beautiful, although some difficulties because of the language. But so I would, choose one of the more beautiful flowing translations, one that sounds good to the ear, even more so than one that you might want to use for theological study, because these things were written for the ear. They are written to be heard, and this is why the King James Version is still considered some of the greatest poetry in the English language, even by people who don't value it as truth.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. I hear also that you're saying, um, obviously language, we know this is true, but poetry is very human. And so the academics or those who seem to cut people off of that and say, this is sort of for those up here in the ivory tower, they're doing a disservice to those who would possibly love poetry, and grow up on it, and eventually learn to become better readers and so on.
That's right.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think going back then, let's just um, let me ask a question regarding your first publication. How did that come about? What is it? How did you feel when you received that acceptance, or tell us about that.
Okay. Well, I'll kind of answer that in two different ways. First of all, my earliest published poems in journals or magazines. First ones appeared in a journal called White Wall Review, which is a publication of Ryerson University in Toronto. And then another early one was Radix, which is a Christian arts publication out of Berkeley. Those were some of my earliest places where my poems appeared. And when that happened, that was just very exciting. And I'm sure anybody who's a poet or anybody who even dabbled in poetry and had something published, or someone who's published articles or published some, whatever. I mean, there is a thrill to that, a feeling of, okay, I'm not just writing in my back room, but I've written something and somebody out there reads it. I would suspect both Riley and Bart that you had a very similar feeling when you got your hands on your first copy of Solum, that when that came, like you were just ecstatic because you had brought something exciting into the world. And even though some of my earliest poetry wasn't as strong, although some of the early ones I still really love, even so, it was a beginning and it was a process, and I was moving forward. Now, my first book was what's called a chapbook, and I know you gentlemen know about chapbooks, but just a very small staple stitch publication, which came out a year before my first full-length book. This little chapbook is called So the Moon Would Not Be Swallowed. And that book is a collection of poems, all of them based on letters that my grandparents wrote home. They were missionaries in China from 1923 to 1951, and they were writing letters home to their family in Canada. And reading those letters inspired poetry for me. So it was really exciting to be able to put that together and have it actually accepted as a book, because that is another step forward, just like those first publications in magazines. A first book, even though it's wasn't a full-fledged production, just a smaller one. I mean, that's still equally exciting to have that happen. So yeah, I was, I don't know how to say it without being cliche almost. I have to think a while, start using, cliches about how exciting that was for me.
Yeah, Don. Yeah, I imagine that every poet feels that way, as they're getting off the ground. Now, back in those days, did you have a definitive experience that made you realize what your calling was with poetry? I remember at the beginning of this, you said that your calling has also evolved into welcoming other Christian poets and helping them to kind of find themselves. Do you think that you kind of, your calling evolved as you were going along and it became a dual calling, or do you think that your calling is still mainly poetry, writing poetry?
Well, first of all, I guess I think of the term calling in the way that I think it is there. It is something God has called me to do, although my ears aren't always quite attuned to exactly what that is or where that will be. And I think each of us as Christians are like that. We receive a calling from God and we know He wants us to do things, but we don't necessarily know exactly what those are. For me, I was my call to poetry was fairly slow. I only discovered that poetry is my calling when I stopped and looked back and realized where I'd been, and just realized how much sense that made for me. I think of it a little bit as like when Jesus healed a man who'd been blind from birth. So I started looking about me, and as I started seeing things at who God had made me to be, and what had always been important to me through the years, it was suddenly plain to me, although I hadn't seen it earlier. What was the second part you were asking there, Riley? Or
Yeah, when did you start to feel the second call to uplift other
okay.
Christian poets?
Right. Thank you. That was also fairly gradual. Again, I suppose I needed to begin to find my own way before I'd have a clue about trying to help somebody else find their way. A little bit like that beam in our own eyes before we help somebody take the speck out of theirs. I guess the opposite, of course, because you're assisting. But as time went on, I was always wanting to encourage other people who were on the same road that I was. I started a blog actually 11 years ago this week called Kingdom Poets. And as I was writing every week about different Christian poets, I really took delight in encouraging poets that weren't as far down the line, but were doing okay. And then also I started taking delight, this may sound funny, but in encouraging poets who are actually dead. That is to remind people of these people from the past who maybe are have slipped off the radar, and to draw them back into our eyes and say, take a look here. And if you have followed the history of poetry, you'll often find that there are poets who might have been very popular in their day, and then the next generation, their style of poetry goes out of fashion, and then 100 years later, suddenly people discover them anew and they go, wow, this person's amazing. And a lot of poets from 1600s may have not kind of slipped away and were brought back in the early 20th century, like people like T.S. Eliot, who really found, wow, these poets who I'm looking into, they're amazing. And suddenly, they're suddenly being brought back into the university as people to study because they were amazing poets. So in some ways, I'm encouraging those poets, if you want to, think of it that way. But then more recently, in my role at McMaster Divinity College, over the last 2 years, I've had a project called Poems for Ephesians, where I have poets write a poem based in some way inspired by the book of Ephesians. Now, on that particular site, people do not have to be established poets. I've had some very well-established poets. I've also had some people who are writers but haven't really done much in poetry who've written something for it, which is kind of cool. Or poets who are beginning, they're only starting to, they maybe hadn't even had anything published anywhere, and their very first poetry credit was Poems for Ephesians. And they might get published right next to somebody like Malcolm Guite or Scott Cairns or Lucy Shaw or Jeannie Walker, some amazing poets, and their poet winds up, the week before or the week after. So
that's amazing. I so want to read all those poems now. So this question leads a little bit into what you were leans into a little bit more what you were sort of describing in your answer just now. But do you find yourself now writing from intuition more than writing from authorial influence? And especially, I also want to ask a second part to this. So, like, when you were starting off, which one was it? Was it authorial influence or was it intuition, or how did you, what was that process like?
Well, you're right, Bart, in that the way we write evolves. And it's harder for me to look back to the same extent and answer that as I could right now. But to answer it, first of all, I'd say right now it certainly is more from intuition, although I am always seeking to find inspiration from other writers, looking at what they're doing, looking at what they're thinking, looking at approaches they're taking, even to write in a way that almost fights against what they're doing to try to take it in a different way. But to learn from other people, I mean, that's extremely important. And but I try to write much more from, and I'm not sure if intuition is the right word, but maybe it is. Inspiration, maybe that's the word. Imagination, that may be the word. But I wouldn't say that I follow other poets' styles very much. And I think we'll probably get into that as we go along.
So do you find any particular school of poetry very particularly inspiring, like postmodern or modern, Renaissance, classical, just anything like that? Do you find yourself kind of gravitating back to like any particular time?
Thanks, Riley. First, I want to say that these labels that we put on the different schools of poetry or time periods, they're really much more useful for those people who are writing essays about poetry than for people who are actually writing poetry. John Donne, for example, would be extremely surprised to hear himself being referred to as a metaphysical poet. Academics are the ones who talk about the different schools of poetry, but even so, I must say that I love a lot of metaphysical poetry. I also love the Romantics. I love the best of early modernist poetry. And yet, and in extension, a lot of 20th century free verse, but yet I still find that I appreciate what some of the new formalists are doing. Now, it might sound a bit like I'm a politician here when I'm giving that answer, a politician for poetry. But again, if you take a look at my blog, Kingdom Poets, you'll find a huge diversity of the type of poets you find there. Because I don't think there's any one school that says, okay, now this group, they figured out what poetry really should be. The fact is, every poet brings who they are to it. Any art form, you know, if we had the answer that there was one way to write a poem and there was one best poem in the world, then now, you know, then everybody be just imitating that. But it's because we are creative, we're trying to take things and do different things, that we interact with it. For my own poetry, I strive to write for the 21st century. There obviously will be influences from the past, but for example, I find it important that I use contemporary language and speak with a contemporary voice. One trend I've noticed in some recent poetry that I particularly dislike is that some less refined recent poetry tends to have this subjectivist attitude. This attitude that says it doesn't matter how your poetry is interpreted because, you know, in these people's view, all meaning is private and personal. But I believe that the best poets, regardless of what school they belong to, what era, even what religion, they are those who look at the world with a belief that inherent in it is truth, and that they just might be able to discover some of that truth. So many poets have done that. They approach their poetry by seeking to discover truth. Not that they're going to find all truth, but that they will find some of it. And the best poets care about the particular, and they're concerned with using language precisely.
Yeah, that's great. That kind of makes me think that you affirm like an objective standard of good poetry, but it can be expressed in different ways as time goes on.
That's right.
But the content is still objectively good, which it makes me kind of I hate to ask, it's the dreaded question every author gets asked, but can poetry be learned through form, and or are writers just kind of born, do you think?
I believe that there's a combination of those things. First of all, any skill that God gives us, we can either nurture it or not. And the fact, that's not to put myself up on a pedestal, because I'm sure there are many things that God has given me which I have successfully neglected. And I've not nurtured as I should. But this is one I believe I have. I do believe that there are certain things that draw us towards different arts. For example, I'm drawn more towards poetry than I am towards painting. Well, one, I happen to be an auditory learner. So because of that, I'm listening as opposed to looking in many ways. And I'm speaking as opposed to drawing. I listen to the sounds. So early on, I was drawn into the beautiful music of the King James Version. I loved music. I grew up in the 60s, and I grew up on this great music, and it spoke to me. And it grabbed me. And from there, looking at good lyrics, and then realizing, that only the songwriting only goes so far. Let's go a little deeper. Let's find some even better writing. And there's all these poets out there. And I started learning in those ways. So I think different people are have orientation. I don't know if that's the right word, more towards visual arts or more towards auditory arts or whatever, or performance. Some people are just, you just see somebody and say, oh, well, they're a born dancer, or they're a born actor. Well, if you just said that to somebody, implying that they didn't have to work at their art form, then they might get very ticked off with you, that they've worked and worked and worked on their dancing, and just said, oh, you're a born dancer, and left it at that. So I think that those things all work together. There's things that we're given, and then we develop them from there.
Don, so when you set out to write a poem, do you have the whole in mind, or do you take it line by line or stanza by stanza? Yeah, and maybe tell of how you began to learn the form, or and then where you took that from there.
Okay. Well, first of all, every poem is different. But I try not to determine ahead of time where the poem is going. Instead of writing a poem to say what I think, I try to write a poem to discover what I think, but also to give the reader a chance to pause and consider what she might think, hopefully without me being too heavy-handed in the process. So it's a place of discovery both for the writer and for the reader. So if I approach it by saying, okay, I'm going to write a poem about this truth of the gospel, this particular truth, it's probably going to fall flat. But if I start writing a poem about some aspect of Jesus' life, and then suddenly this truth jumps out of it, it's more likely to be real. It's more likely to be poetic. So I just play with words and images and concepts and let them go where they want to go, always weighing them to make sure that they're telling the truth, and try to shine fresh light on various aspects of our lives here on this planet. There was another second part to that question, Riley, which I've totally forgotten already.
Oh yeah, it was simply in terms of the form, like learning the form. Do they, when you learn it, do they teach you to take it, to have the end in mind, or to to discover, as you said, what you're thinking?
Well, some forms require a little bit more planning than others. For example, if you're writing a sonnet, you at least need to, you're ahead, it's only 14 lines. You've got a certain rhyme structure, and hopefully you don't have already planned where it's going at the end. You sort of get going with it and let it see where it takes you. But part of that is just getting used to the structure, the form. I don't do a lot of formal poetry, although I do write sonnets and other structured verse, but I really like giving them their own organic form and letting see where they want me to go. I find that I'm learning new approaches all the time. I find I'm much more ready, for example, to take, if I'm working on a poem, to suddenly take it, and I've written 10 lines and I might take the first 5 and suddenly totally rearrange the order of them, take the 4th line and make it the beginning and see what happens there and see if it's better. So I will change things and rework things and see if by coming at it from a different direction, it might flow better, because flow is pretty important, or that I might, or maybe as I'm going along, I find that the real topic of the poem is a little different than I thought, and I want to kind of introduce that a little earlier, things like that. I'm a fanatical reviser. I work it and change it and manipulate it quite a bit as I'm going along, and which I find very helpful. But being free to do that, not to fear that, oh, I've got this line down now, I can't change it at all.
Well, obviously it's working.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, we really enjoyed reading your work, Don, and we really appreciate your time today. And if you'd be willing to close us out with a reading of one of your poems that you published with us, that'd be absolutely amazing.
Okay. Well, I think what I'll do is I'll read the poem that Bart referred to earlier, An Angel Questions Our Answers. And this, by the way, is one of the poems that will be in my new book that'll be coming out this year. The book will be called Angelicus, and every one of the poems is written from the point of view of an angel. So there's the 3 that are in your journal are all from that series. So in this collection, there are 64 poems, all of which are written from that perspective. Some of them are extremely lighthearted, and some of them are very serious, and some of them are very whimsical, coming at things from different angles. But I found it's what this angle has afforded me is a chance to talk about the ordinary world from a very interesting perspective, because the spiritual things get drawn into it, or sometimes to talk about very, very deep things in a very whimsical way. So anyway, this is called An Angel Questions Our Answers. We see you all love games that show how much you know, the puzzles you're able to master faster than anyone, how you can piece bits to fit due to your expertise. But please, descendant of dust, trust us when we say there's so much more you don't get. Consider the birds, the flocks and herds scattered figuratively on the hillside. Why would the good Lord have chosen untamed words for revealing himself to you? Scattered poetic analogies concealing what would have let you settle comfortably into your knowing. Why stories? A flash of sword kaleidoscoping over flowing fields, forcing you from head to heart. Why such incarnations half heard on a steep slope that vary with every telling, making you ponder and wonder and confess you only understand in part? Please don't fight about who's right when together you share hope.
That was beautiful, Don. Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a wonderful poem. I love that poem. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much
so
for
much.
reading it for us.
Yes, yeah. I even noticed it's even better read aloud. I kind of wonder now if you're more like of an oratory poet, or just more of like a sit down and read it, kind of deal.
Well, I really believe that good poetry needs to work in both ways. It needs to work out loud, but oral poetry needs to also work on the page. And And that's not to say that that some other forms aren't valid, but what I'm saying is I think the best poetry does that. It causes you to think about it, so you want to go back and look at it. But on the other hand, it needs to have that musical quality to it to draw you into it and move you forward. I find delight in that kind of stuff, and I think that that's important. Even though it's play, that play is important, and it's all part of that creative process God gave us.
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the best things about your poetry is that you can be whimsical and yet profound at the same time. Just like with that poem that you just read us. And I love the concept of Angelicus. And I'm so looking forward to reading it when it comes out. So anyway, thank you so much, Don. Do you have anything else for us, Bart?
No, it's just I'm kind of floored with the fact that you read it. That's pretty awesome. You never know what it's meant to sound like until you have the author read it. But yeah. Anyway, so I just want to thank you, Don, for joining us on the podcast as we finish up, and thanks for listening. If you listened on the podcast, we appreciate you, and yeah, we love that you're on this ride with us.
Thank you, everyone.